I internet a lot, so I can't remember if I told you all this here or if it came up somewhere else in my internet travels. But when I was little one time, my kid sister and I went to maybe a graduation ball for my dad from seminary. Feels like that might have been it. Maybe a wedding reception. I don't know. Yeah, I was young. I don't remember for sure. We were all dressed up. I was wearing this little suit, fine young man haircut and all of that. And my kid sister, she was wearing a white frilly dress, and we were little, like maybe 5 and 3, something like that. And some music came on, and everybody went out and danced, and I was like, I'm going to take my sister out and dance. And I got so much, affirmation for that. And ladies were coming over and being like, you are such a nice gentleman. And it felt great, and it was really great. But my sister was also irritating, and at some point in the dance, she irritated me to the point that I felt like a good way to express that to her would be to body slam her. And people were not as charmed by that. They felt like that was a really gross thing to do. And as I look back on it strategically from a social perspective, that probably wasn't the best way to further endear myself or to ride the wave of goodwill that was all flowing in my favor. Likewise, in Matthew chapter 21, Jesus rolls into Jerusalem, which is the big town. This is the place you want to go. And who knows, fingers crossed, are people going to like having me here? He rolls into town and everybody's like, that is amazing. It's so good that you're here. And they yell a bunch of Bible verses at him. And they throw their coats on the ground and let him tromp with muddy poop-footed donkey hooves over the top of it, and they yell a bunch more, and they say a bunch of nice things about it, and everybody's like, what a fine young gentleman he is. And it's going great. And then to ride that wave of goodwill better, Jesus goes over to the temple and wrecks a bunch of people's tables and flips them over and yells about some stuff. I don't know. I didn't write the Bible. It's just what happened. Here's the verse. Matthew 21:12, Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It's written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers. But then the blind and the lame came to him at the temple and he healed them. So it seems like it kind of works out. But I mean, wait a minute. Like, why are we just rolling on to everybody's happy and stuff's cool and more people are yelling, Hosanna, son of David? I mean, what about this thing where he broke tables and yelled at people and stuff? Well, here's the deal. As best as I can tell, it looks like the Old Testament sacrificial system gets augmented to accommodate the new modern realities in which the people of the first century find themselves. And I understand. When you and I look back on history, and I do mean you and I, because I'm in the same boat here, even though I like history. When you and I look back on history, there is what I like to call a compressive effect. If we're talking about 2010 versus 1990, every single one of you can tell the difference between styles, media, verbiage, slang, fads, anything. You can tell the difference between that. And it's only 20 years difference, 30 years difference from now. But if we go back to, say, 1710 and 1690, you wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. It'd be harder to tell. If we went back another 1,000 years or 1,500 years, it gets way harder. And so here we're talking about a change in sophistication from the time that the law of the Old Testament was initiated to the time that we're reading about in the New Testament. We're talking about like 1,400, 1,200 years conservatively of the evolution of society and time and politics and culture. And it was not all the same. It's not like, oh, well, for that whole time, people just took rocks and banged it on the strips of dried out leather and scooped food out of the muddy bank of the river and just like ate goop and glop and stuff and grunted at each other in their skins and hides that they wore. Like, no, this is a very sophisticated time in history. And in fact, we did not regain as a Western civilization this degree of sophistication until really very, very recently. That is a lot different, that being the time of Jesus, than things were coming out of Egypt in 1400, 1300, 1200 BC. These are very, very different times, and so much water has passed under the bridge. Inventions have happened, and not just physical inventions or material inventions, like moving through bronze and iron and steel and things like that, but also You're talking about intellectual inventions, notions of democracy and the value of the individual conceived of in new ways, new notions of what the city means and what a cosmopolitan place means, and new imagination horizons for trade and cultural exchange, new levels of exposure to other social and even religious ideas. And so when the law was put down in the Old Testament, you get some stuff in there that's like, well, make sure to make this concession for poorer people. And then you fast forward 1,500 years, stuff is way, way different. And it still smacks a little bit of that very simple early law, the very simple law of this is a temple, or early on a tabernacle, a tent where God dwells, and this is how you do the sacrifices, and this is the role the priest plays. You got to scale that. You have to figure out ways to get more people through the system. You got to figure out ways to have the right animals there. I mean, early on, the animals were right there around the tent where you're supposed to do sacrifices. They were just stone's throw out into the field outside of the temple. You just go get one of those. But Jerusalem's huge now. It's one of the 5 biggest cities in the Mediterranean world. And you got to go a long ways if you want to find some kind of animal to sacrifice there. And so I think, understandably to some extent, a bunch of people look at that situation and they're like, let's just put the animals right here. And then people who have to do these sacrifices, they can come through and they can buy them, and then they can do the sacrifice that they're supposed to do. It's no longer an agrarian society. Jerusalem at this point has become an artisanal, merchant-driven market society. This is a very different thing. And so from a historical perspective, an economic perspective, you can understand why there would be sacrificial animal booths, an entire marketplace that sprung up here. You can understand why it would be very lucrative. You can understand why the ebb and flow of the live animal market would cause prices to fluctuate. You can understand how some of the people in these different booths would communicate with others, see what the prices are at, and make sure they're scratching each other's back to ensure that prices are going to be good. And you're also going to have a degree of licensure and attention from the religious elites. So it's not like this is an entirely free market proposition. You've also got an official governmental theocratic element to this thing. And you put all of that together, and apparently what's going on here is that this has moved beyond providing a helpful service to something that is exploiting people. And that seems to be what trips Jesus' trigger, is that people are being robbed. We see again and again throughout the book of Matthew. We're going to see it intensely here in a couple of pages. We see it intensely toward the end of the book of Luke. We see this theme of Jesus having a real sore spot for people who put up impediments between your normal, run-of-the-mill, everyday person and God. He doesn't like these blind guides who can't see truth themselves, yet hold themselves out as being capable of leading and guiding people toward what they need to do. We know that Matthew has thoroughly developed the theme that the people who can't see and aren't impressive actually can see. The blind can see, and those who can see are actually blind. I think this is all a part of that motif. So Jesus shows up in Matthew. This is the first time we have him in Jerusalem or at the temple. We know from the book of John that he's been down this direction before. We know from also the book of Luke. In Luke, what would that be? It's got to be chapter 2. Maybe chapter 3. No, it's got to be chapter 2. Jesus is at the temple there as well. So he knows the place. He's been there before. The sights and smells and sounds are not going to be a surprise to him. But there's something unique about this trip where he's like, all right, we're doing this thing. Probably there were people who were there who were like, why would anybody even get mad about this? We are considering the poor and the downtrodden. The ancient law says that there's some kind of allowance for people who can't afford the full sacrifices. We have a whole wide variety of inventory. We sell cheap sacrificial things like doves. We learned that elsewhere. We sell expensive stuff for the fancy sacrificers. Like, we've taken all of that into account, and we assure you these are fair market prices. I just don't understand how anybody could be mad. But Jesus sees that differently and isn't just going to go and passive-aggressively tweet about it. He is going to flip over tables and make quite the issue of it. And next time around, we're just going to have to think about strategically what he's doing here in not riding the wave of goodwill that he earns right off the bat, in the same way that I'd earned the goodwill of being a nice older brother and then went and squandered it by body slamming my sister. So Jesus has earned goodwill, and it looks like he's squandering it by flipping over tables. So we got to consider his motives on all of this. And also we have to consider, like, what are the implications of this one? This is one of those texts that comes up a lot as people debate what it is that Jesus actually wants in terms of how you resist bad ideas or even resist authority figures who are doing messed up stuff. Is vandalism okay if things are bad or evil enough? We're going to work through all of that stuff. We're going to have fun doing it. Thank you for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.